Hi, everybody out there. Today we are continuing with our investigation and series of reports into the death of Ellen Greenberg. And one of the people that knows quite a bit about it is Guy DeAndrea, who's with us now. He was in the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office where the case was originally handled. And Guy investigated it separately after the rest of the staff, settled on that it was suicide. But then, Guy, as I understand it, you started looking into the file yourself. And when you did, you discovered a lot of unanswered questions and discrepancies, shall we say. Is that correct?
That's accurate. Yes.
All right. Now, one of the key pieces of evidence that you've mentioned quite a bit and other people have that were involved in this case is the tissue sample from the spinal column. And according to a forensic pathologist, a neuropathologist, she says that there was no hemorrhage, meaning that that stab wound with a knife in the back of the neck had to be inflicted post-mortem after she died. And that could be a real key to this case. Now, what I find curious is that Marlon Osborne, who was the original medical examiner in this case, who originally declared it, by the way, homicide. It originally said it was homicide. Then, after being talked to by people in your office, the DA's office in Philly, where you were at the time, now you're in private practice, but after being interviewed by people in the DA's office and by the police, Osborne was, quote, persuaded to change his mind and change the finding to suicide after originally saying that it was homicide. Is that correct so far?
Sort of. My review of the file was that after declaring this a homicide, he was provided with information from the Philadelphia Police Department homicide unit that indicated no individual could have done this outside of Ellen because of the deadbolt locking mechanism. I very quickly debunked that in my review. But that was the information, as I understood it, that was provided to him, which then caused, in part, if not exclusively, the change in the finding.
All right, but that meeting that occurred after his original finding of homicide, it was with people in the Philadelphia Police Department and also in your office at the time, in the DA's office in Philly?
That meeting, I had no records. If there are records that have been found since, I did not find any records that indicated at least that meeting. There was many meetings that also involved the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, but the meeting concerning the latching or deadbolt mechanism, that was between the police department and the medical examiner's office.
All right, the meeting that led to
and it was just a phone call, not a meeting.
Oh, okay, a telephonic meeting. Now, that meeting by phone call, which persuaded Marlon Osborne, the medical examiner, to change his finding from homicide to suicide, that was all keyed only around the latch, the locking mechanism.
Yeah, it was described as a deadbolt. And when I heard that, that's the first thing I went to, because I envisioned a deadbolt like the deadbolt system that I grew up with, which is wildly unsafe, that locks only on the inside with no locking mechanism on the outside. And if you wanted to breach the door with that type of deadbolt, I mean, you would either need considerable force or some form of a ram and you would take the door off the hinges, right? I mean, it would be considerable force that would be needed. And then when I looked into it, that wasn't the type.
Right. The police photos taken at the time showed one screw being somewhat dislodged, but not the type of dislodgement that would have been a result of somebody breaking in, as Sam Goldberg, the fiance, claims. Correct.
Right. It wasn't even a deadbolt. It was just a hotel latch, really, at the end of the day.
Okay. Now, getting back to that key tissue sample of the spinal column, the back of the neck. Now, sometime later, after Dr. Lindsay, also a neuropathologist, declared that it was inflicted post-mortem after she died, then apparently officials came up with the information that previously Dr. Lucy Rourke Adams had examined it and found that there was nothing remarkable to indicate that it was post-mortem. Is that correct?
There was, right. Well, it was more so whether or not the spinal column had an impact pre-mortem. In other words, if the stab wound had pierced the spinal column, the question was, would this render her immediately incapacitated? Not dead, but immediately incapacitated, such that she would not be able to fight back and ultimately then would not be able to place the knife into her own heart.
Right.
The significant thing about the Rourke examination is that in my review of the file and in all the follow-up and questioning and everything I did, there is no evidence. There is nothing to suggest that that examination had ever even taken place.
So actually, this supposed examination by Dr. Lucy Rourke Adams contradicted the finding by Lindsay Emery. And what's strange about this, even stranger, is that when contacted by the Greenberg's family lawyer, attorney Pedraza, and investigator Tom Brennan, the way I understand it, she said that Dr. Lucy Rourke Adams, she said she had no recollection of ever doing that alleged examination that they claimed that she did. This was Marlon Osborne claiming that. She said she had no recollection and no record, no invoice, nothing that would indicate that exam was ever done. So therefore, what do we conclude from that? Is somebody lying?
Yeah. So, I mean, I spoke to her as well. When I first looked into this years and years and years ago, she back then, which was much closer in time to the actual events, had no recollection of performing any examination. Again, agreed, no invoice, no billing statement, no, even the logs. When you go to the medical examiner's office, you have to fill out a logbook. Nothing indicated she was even present when it was said that she performed this examination. And I even asked for, okay, if she doesn't have a log or a invoice, I asked for show me the paid money to her, because she was not an employee of the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office. She was, per diem, because they didn't have at the time an on-staff neuropathologist. Right. And so show me that you paid her for her work, for her examination. And then there wasn't any information. So how that got into the medical examiner's report that she did this examination, it's a mystery, and no one's been able to answer that. Can I say 100% the examination wasn't done? No. Can I say 99.99%? Sure.
So it could have been, I know you're being careful here, as you should be. It could have been an intentional lie, a cover-up.
Could it have been? Sure. Anything's possible. I want an answer to that question, though, for sure. It is a big misstatement, if that is what we're going to call it, to put in there that another doctor, a neuropathologist, did an examination that she just didn't do. And not just that she did it, but actually had findings as a result of doing it. It's very troubling.
Yeah, in fact, I believe investigator Tom Brennan, who you know about,
sure.
He says that Marlon Osborne, the medical examiner, the original medical examiner, said that he walked the sample over across the street and did a curbside exam. And that's when that finding was done by Dr. Lucy Rourke Adams. And again, getting back to Adams' statement, she has no recollection of that. So again, there's another statement by the original medical examiner who was persuaded to change his finding from homicide to suicide. So there's another statement by this medical examiner that there's no proof of, that he walked it over and that she examined it.
I would be perplexed to believe. Look, I've heard crazier things. I would be shocked to find out that Dr. Rourke, a highly regarded neuropathologist, did a curbside review of a portion of a woman's spinal column. It would be, look, if that happened, I'll be shocked then, because that would seem
wrong in so many different ways.
Yeah, well, you know, another thing adding to the mystery about this is that when it got to Shapiro's office, Attorney General Josh Shapiro is now running for governor. When it got to his office, when it was kicked over to his office, he was saying that Dr. Lindsay Emery, she, quote, misspoke when she concluded that was inflicted post-mortem, correct?
That was my understanding, but that post dated my investigation. That I had already left the DA's office.
I mean, if as far as I know, Shapiro's office has never explained what he meant by she misspoke,
right,
in her conclusion. So that again is another loose end to the so-called thorough investigation by Shapiro's office, correct?
Yeah, I mean, this entire case, I mean, literally from start to finish, has always, for me, which is why it has stayed with me this long, has way more unanswered questions than it ever had answered questions.
Yeah. Well, you see, another thing that came up in one of the interviews you've done that I was looking at is that Sam Goldberg, the fiance who found Ellen's body inside their apartment, he was questioned at the apartment building itself or at police headquarters or both.
There would have been preliminary questions asked of him at the scene. Ultimately, though, there was a formal interview, meaning reduced to writing, at the police station, at the police department.
So you're assuming that, or there's evidence that he was interviewed both at the apartment and at the police station?
There was indication that he was spoken to on scene, but there was nothing that I recall seeing memorialized, the formal statement, because on scene oftentimes is police officers responding, not to say they can't get some biographical or background information, which they did. So he was spoken to, but the appropriate procedure is to take someone who's either a witness, a suspect, anything along those lines down to headquarters to actually do a formal interview by a detective.
Now, the lawyer uncle, attorney Schwartzman, who showed up at the apartment complex that night, was he present during questioning in either place, the apartment or at the police station?
There's no indication that he was present on scene, but nothing would have prevented him from being present during that. My recollection is that at the police department, Sam was represented by a criminal defense attorney.
At least at the police department. Do we know who that criminal defense attorney was?
I believe it was either Mr. Perry or Mr. McMonigal.
And
Fred Perry or Brian McMonigal.
And they're both prominent defense criminal attorneys?
Oh, I think they're the best. I mean, they are truly the best in the business.
Now, is there any record of the questioning itself, at least at the police station, which is supposed to be the formal part of the questioning? Is that in the police file somewhere, and have we had access to it?
Yeah, there was a formal statement taken. So there's questions verbatim asked, and then verbatim answers given that would then be memorialized on what's called a 75-483, which is a written statement given by either a witness or someone who might have critical information. So yes, back when I was at the DA's office, I did review that statement. So that would have been about 6 or so years ago. So probably more than that.
Is that statement now accessible to reporters like me?
It should be under a FOIA request. Whether they give it to you or not is, your guess is as good as mine. But that is part of the police file.
The way I understand it, they've been very reluctant or just actually refused to release any of these files. That's the information I'm getting from the other side, the attorney representing the family. So, I mean, do you know if that's the case, that they're refusing to release these files?
That's been my understanding. And my understanding is that they have been relying upon CREA, which there is a bill either has passed or will be passing soon before our legislature, which should free up and allow for both attorneys and the media to have more access, as they should, to certain files. But my understanding is that they have been using CREA as a shield to prevent people such as yourself and even the attorney representing the Greenbergs from obtaining that information.
Is there any legitimate reason that they should not be freely releasing these files? Since they've declared it a suicide, it's not a crime. So is there any logical, legitimate, valid reason why these files should be not released to the public, why there's so much resistance to releasing them?
In this case specifically, no. There are cases that I would say yes. In this case, they've ruled this a suicide. In other words, they're saying this case is closed. So there's no legitimate or reasonable basis to withhold it, in the sense that they can't claim this is an active investigation, that by releasing the information, it could have a negative impact on the investigation, because that I understand as a prosecutor and as a litigator now. But when a case is closed, then the only thing they can fall back on is CREA, or if it's otherwise confidential or protected material, like someone's medical records, social security number, those types of privacy type considerations.
So there is no valid reason why they should not release them,
other than CREA. CREA is the only thing they can stand on.
Yeah. Okay. Now, also another curious development here is, according to Gavin Fish, he's been also investigating this. He has a series of podcasts on. I think he's talked to you as well.
I believe he has. Yeah, a lot of people have spoken to me about this.
Now he says that after he was posting a lot of stuff about Attorney Schwartzman, the lawyer uncle of Sam Goldberg, the fiance, that he got a letter from Schwartzman. And in that letter, Schwartzman claims, among other things, that the police actually questioned Sam Goldberg for 3 hours at the apartment itself. And during those 3 hours, the lawyer uncle wasn't with him to be with him as he was being questioned by police. Have you heard of that claim by Attorney Schwartzman?
I have not heard of that claim, and there was nothing in the file to suggest that happened. Now, it may have happened. There was just no notation of it. It would seem unlikely. Again, from being a homicide prosecutor, it's rare that you question someone to that capacity on scene. It just doesn't. I mean, I'm not saying it's never happened. It would be a very unique circumstance in which someone would do that.
According to the gist of the letter, as explained to me by Gavin Fish, Schwartzman is claiming that when police said it's okay if we question him, they said, yeah, go ahead. And he wasn't, he stayed away while they were questioning him for 3 hours. That's his claim anyway, which, even to a novice like me, a layman like me, I'm not an attorney, that seems, wouldn't you say, highly unlikely?
I would say that's highly unlikely. Was he on scene for 3 hours? Maybe, probably. I mean, if you put into that the hour or plus that he waited to call the police, then the time it takes him to get there, talking to them sort of, I don't want to say casually because that's not the right word, but giving them background information to the first responders, he may have been on scene for 3 hours. I would find it to be highly unlikely, highly improbable that he would have been interrogated or questioned for 3 hours.
Well, let's get a little more background on attorney Jim Schwartzman, who's the lawyer uncle of the fiance who showed up that night at the apartment. And he's a prominent attorney in Philadelphia, and I believe he deals with defenses of lawyers and judges with ethical violations. Is that correct?
That was my understanding. I don't know the man personally.
Okay, but now he was in private practice then as a prominent attorney, well known in Philly. And then now, I guess he was appointed by Governor Wolf to be the president judge of the Judicial Review Board. I don't know if that's a formal name, but what it does, it examines ethical violations by judges. Is that correct?
That's my understanding of what his career trajectory has been.
Okay, so even before he became the president judge of the Ethics Board, as an experienced, well-known, prominent attorney in Philly, is it somewhat questionable that he would not realize that he shouldn't be taking electronic devices from the apartments before it was secured by police?
Well, so it's a little, at least my review was a little bit different, which I found to be
troubling in another way. My understanding is that he was permitted, which is different than just taking, right? He was permitted to take the devices by first responders and or detectives on scene. That shocked me and perplexed me when I read that in the file, because again, I came years after Ellen's death. In terms of my review, because the homicide detectives and police officers that I worked with routinely in homicide they were amazing. And the idea of handing over critical, potentially electronic devices to even a witness, let alone a suspect potentially, is obscene, if not unheard of.
And as an experienced attorney, he would have known that.
Well, look, if you're a defense attorney and a cop's allowing you to take stuff off the scene, I can't say if I'm representing someone and an officer's like, you're free to take the electronics, I'm probably going to take the electronics. Honestly, I don't represent defendants. I represent victims. But, if the police are letting you take it, shame on them.
Well, the way I understand it is that the way this came about is that I guess the following day after the death, he called the apartment manager and asked permission to enter the apartment because he wanted to pick up a suit for Sam Goldberg for the funeral, which would have been done quickly because of the Jewish faith. So he wanted to come in right away, pick up a suit for the funeral, but also, so the apartment manager said, well, let me check on that. She called the police, the Philadelphia police, and told of the request, and apparently they didn't have a problem with that. And then she said, the apartment manager said, well, it's a bloody mess and all that. I hate to have them go in if it's not cleaned up. So the police recommended a civilian company which specializes in cleaning up crime scene. And the police said, yeah, in fact, they gave her the number of that person, or at least told her who that company was. So that's how that came about. And that complicates it even more, because not only was Schwartzman given permission to enter the apartment, where he ended up taking the electronic devices as well as the suit, presumably, but also it was a matter of the crime scene or the death scene being cleaned up before police had a chance to examine. So all that potential evidence was scrubbed away, correct?
Gone. Yeah, gone.
Now, that in itself, how does something like that happen? Even though it was determined, even though at the time police were treating it as a suicide, the official declaration hadn't been made yet by the medical examiner if it was a suicide, homicide, or whatever. So the police say, yeah, go ahead, clean up the apartment, let people in. So that in itself, wasn't that a stark violation of proper police procedures?
They ruled it a suicide, the police department, but I agree with you that proper protocol would have been to wait for an official pronouncement from the medical examiner's office. Now, at that point, the police could have still maintained the position that, all right, doc, you can call this a homicide, but it's not. It's a suicide. And then at that point, what typically happens is the district attorney's office gets involved if they weren't already involved, and makes a determination as to whether or not an investigation should follow, an additional investigation should follow, and then ultimately whether or not charges should be brought.
So to clarify this then, even though the police decided on their own initially to treat it as a suicide, the medical examiner had not pronounced it either way at that point.
That's what I recall.
And therefore, if that's what happened, that was a big violation of procedures, because the police, can't let the apartment be wide open to anybody who wants to come in until there's an official finding by the medical examiner, correct?
That's how it should have happened. Yes, they should have waited for the pronouncement from the medical examiner. Is
it a clear violation of official police procedures?
I would say, yeah. I'm not an expert in police procedures, but I would say yes. I would be, if I was the investigative prosecutor on that file at the time, I would have been beyond furious.
All right. Now, there were 20 stab wounds. 10 to the front, the chest, the abdomen, 10 to the back, including the spinal cord, which was key in this. Yet, again, that seemed to be go by the board. Nobody found that curious, even in the initial statements. But you've said in a previous interview that the wound to the heart was the last inflicted. How do we know that?
Well, if we're assuming that there was one knife utilized, then it would have had to have been the last stab wound because the knife was still lodged into her chest. And there was no indication that I saw that would indicate the knife went into the chest, was removed. In other words, the resting place of the knife was in fact the chest. So we don't know the sequence of the stabs, but if that was the only knife utilized, the fact that there was no indication that the knife was ever removed, it would have had to have been the last stab wound.
And why is that key?
Well, it's key in that if it depends on which side you're viewing this from. In other words, if the evidence clearly shows that the stab wound, the one specifically to the spinal column, which my understanding has shown since being examined by two different, I believe, neuropathologists that have indicated the spinal column was in fact pierced. If it was pierced, what would happen is the body becomes immediately incapacitated. In other words, Ellen could have been cognizant, awake, understanding what was happening to her, but would have been incapable of utilizing her motor skills. In other words, she would not have had the ability to wield the knife or do anything in that for that matter. Additionally, her body would have essentially been paralyzed. I'm not saying officially paralyzed, but paralyzed in the sense that she would not have been able to utilize her motor functions.
And what if there were two knives that were used? Now, I understand there's evidence now in a reconstruction type of scientific analysis that wasn't available at the time. But according to that analysis, there's indications that two knives were used.
I did see that.
You did see that?
After the fact. I mean, I've seen it recently because I've been following.
Yeah. So if two knives were used, then does that still mean that she couldn't have stabbed herself in the heart?
It depends. If two knives were utilized, then no, the stab wound to the heart doesn't have to be the last stab wound. In other words, that could have been the first stab wound, right? I mean, that could have gone in, killed her almost immediately, I would imagine. And then post-mortem, the second knife could have been used to inflict some of the other wounds. A deeper analysis of which knife caused which wounds would, I think, highlight more indicatively some sequence, right? Potentially some sequence.
Only one knife was found.
Only one knife was found.
Any theories on that?
Well, I mean, if someone committed a homicide against Ellen, then they would have had plenty of opportunity to remove a second knife or clean a second knife or do something with a second knife. In other words, from the time she is killed to the time the police gets there, I mean, it's if you go by Sam's statement, it's well over an hour plus.
Now, another peculiarity, I think, is what wasn't noted by Marlon Osborne, the medical examiner, on his report, even, when it originally declared a homicide and a suicide, but nowhere in the report, as I understand, is an indication of a significant amount of bruising in various stages of healing. Is that correct?
I want to say that was in a supplemental report, but it was definitely part of the medical examiner's file. It wasn't part of the official findings, but it was part of the file because that's how I knew about it.
So at some point, Marlon Osborne, the medical examiner, did indicate that there were multiple bruises.
Well, it could have been that, or it could have been, this is the one piece it had to have come from the medical examiners. And I know that I reviewed photographs of Ellen from within the medical examiner's office. So there was photographs as well as to the bruising. Said it differently, whether or not he indicated it in the report, any person who examined Ellen during the autopsy would have clearly seen the significant bruising in all stages of healing on her body.
Now, also something he allegedly missed was indications of possible strangulation, correct?
That was later reviewed by another pathologist and did determine that that was a likely, if not actual, outcome of what happened. I don't, in my review of again, I was just reviewing photographs. I was more concerned with, not more concerned, that's it's the wrong term, but I was reviewing the crime scene. The lack of blood on the crime scene was very troubling and concerning to me. The blood pooling on the face was very concerning to me. And then the medical examiner's photographs in terms of the bruising was very concerning to me. And I don't have a recollection of honing in on the potential strangulation.
Now, you said that there was, quote, a tremendous amount of bruising. So there were a lot of bruising all over.
On all along, I mean, nowhere that you would observe with clothing on. In other words, it's, side, breast area, legs. It was on the parts of the body that would be covered with clothing.
Doesn't this smack of possible abuse, somebody being abused?
That's what is suggested to me, that someone in her life had been physically abusing her. Otherwise, I mean, I've said this before, some of the explanations I was getting, and I mean, it's not funny, but someone had said, like, well, she did Pilates. And I said, well, wait, like what, full contact Pilates? Like, what do we, I mean, I know it's a little flippant but like, what are you talking about? Like, my mom did Pilates, right? I mean, like, you don't get these, you might get a bruise if you fall off, I suppose, the blocks, but you wouldn't get this type of injuries from working out. I mean, it's laughable, but not in a funny way, if that makes sense. So I never got a good explanation or justification of how she obtained all those bruises.
Guy, you're to be commended for your independent review of the case file while you were in the in the district attorney's office, where this case originally was handled. But let me ask you this, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
sure.
With all these loose ends, unanswered questions, roads that were not pursued, do you attribute that just to sloppy police work and even sloppiness in the DA's office at the time, or what? How could all this happen like this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think sometimes people who make mistakes, if that's what this was, can do one of two things when confronted with the mistake. They can own it, realizing that owning it's not going to be good because there's really not going to be an avenue to fix it. In other words, crime scene was cleaned. We can't do luminol testing. Things may have been missed. So you can own it and take it, right, for what you messed up on. Or you can double down. And then when you get caught on the next mistake, you double down again. And I think when someone takes, or people take that approach, is when you see the compound nature of all of these unanswered questions and problems literally compounding upon themselves, creating an utter mess.
All right. So in other words, let me pursue this. And again, this is probably a delicate thing for you to answer, but is it a matter of, it was kind of just like sloppy police work to begin with, but then as more and more of these discrepancies piled up and were uncovered, then at some point it became an intentional cover-up?
I won't say that. I will certainly not. Well, here's why, at least from the DA's office. So I've explained this to the family. I've explained this to anyone who's asked. And to me, I try to go with the conclusion and logic that makes the most sense. When I went to my boss and said, listen, I've been asked to review this file. Do you have a problem with me reviewing this file? My boss, who was also in homicide back when this first occurred, is now literally in charge of homicide. She could have looked at me and said, Guy, you have 20 plus active homicides on your desk. You're telling me that you have enough time with people who need your investigative skills to now investigate a case that's already been closed.
And I would have not even thought untoward of that. I would go, you know what? You're absolutely right. I have a lot. She said, by all means, I know you're thorough. And if you come up with something, bring it to me and we'll reevaluate. In other words, if they were in on the cover up, why would she ever, relatively young DA who she knew my skills, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but she knew what I could do and she knew what I could uncover. And she knew the connections I had in the police department who would help me. If the DA's office was in on it, she would have shut it down in a way that would have made sense. You know what I mean?
All right. Well, maybe initially, people just didn't realize how bad the lack of proper investigation was. But let me bring up again that telephonic meeting with Marlon Osborne, the medical examiner, where he was persuaded by non-medical people, by the police and people from your office. He was persuaded to change it to suicide. So, I mean, doesn't that smack of some kind of perhaps unlegitimate persuasion?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree that I found it offensive that the key piece of information was that BS locking mechanism as the definitive reason to change. It's not, I've said it all along. That's nonsense. That is a nonsense reason.
All right. So if people from your office were never in on a cover-up, why then were they in on a meeting with Osborne to persuade him to change it to suicide, right? Why would they be doing that at that point?
See, that's the part that I don't, I mean, I'd be happy to review it. And if that happened, I agree. They should not have done that. But my review, he changed the finding pretty quickly. And my review of the file is that was done between him and the detective, not the DA's office. If there's evidence to the contrary, I'm not covering for that. I'd be happy to review it. And if that happened, I'll put it this way. If anyone communicated to Osborne, this should be changed from a homicide to a suicide because of that lacking mechanism, that was wrong. And that should have never happened. So whoever did it, whether it's both the DA's office and the police department, not the entirety of the police department, right? An individual detective and an individual DA or a couple of individuals from both offices, it should have never happened because that locking mechanism was nonsense and it was not a deadbolt. And that should have never, ever been a reason to change the medical examiner's findings.
All right, just to clarify this now, you don't know at this point whether that telephonic meeting included people from the DA's office.
I did not see that in the review, but I'm saying if it's there and they did that, it shouldn't have happened.
Okay, now from the DA's office, eventually it goes to the office of the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro.
Yes.
Twice, Josh Shapiro, who's presented himself during his gubernatorial campaign as a crime fighter, twice he's refused the appeals of the parents to reopen the case. And twice he's redeclared it a suicide. How do you explain that?
I can't. This file absolutely needs to be reinvestigated. I mean, I've said that all along, and I would have pushed it even further had I stayed in the DA's office. In other words, I was leaving the DA's office right at the time as I was imploring the Greenbergs, who I never actually even met in person, by the way. I was imploring them to get me, because they were talking about having an independent neuropathologist review the spinal column. And I said, get me that. As soon as you get that report, send it to me. And when it finally was completed, I had already left the DA's office. So I was no longer a government employee. So there was nothing I could do, at least internally. And then I said, look, but I'm here as a resource. I don't know you personally. I have no stake in this case. But I believe there was a wrong done here. And look, the outcome, right? The outcome and I've always said this to them, the outcome could be that it is ruled a suicide, but could be, right? But what I agree with and what I find so troubling and so upsetting is that there was never a proper investigation completed in this case. So you've robbed a family of being able to sit down and say to them, look, I know you don't want to hear this, but here's the hard evidence that proves this is a suicide.
Right. And, Guy, we're both on the same page with that. Throughout the reports, as you have, I've maintained that it should at least be declared undetermined.
100%.
And we don't know if it was a murder, but we do know definitively, without a doubt, that a proper investigation, a thorough investigation, was never, up to this point, properly conducted. Do we agree on that?
We agree on that.
Okay. Now, my next question is, why such what I think is clearly resistance from Shapiro's office to taking another objective look at the case? Twice he said, no, nothing to see here. Clear-cut suicide with all this contrary evidence that might point in the other direction. Suicide, nothing to see here. Move along. Twice he's refused to open the case. And meanwhile, the parents for over a decade now haven't received any kind of satisfaction that this is ever properly investigated. Their daughter found brutally dead, either by her own hand or somebody else or whatever, and they've gotten nothing but stonewalling from up and down the line, and including Shapiro's office. Why is he so reluctant to open up the case?
Yeah, so I know because I was contacted by them, meaning the Attorney General's office, post my departure from the DA's office when they inherited my file. Meaning, when I say my file, I built the file in a way that I would handle an active homicide. So when they got it, I confirmed. They described to me what the file looked like, and I knew. I'm like, that's exactly how I did it. That's my markings. I had a unique process. In other words, we started chatting, and I don't remember the specific AG I was talking to, but they asked me my impression. I told them that I believe at a minimum this is undetermined, but more likely homicide, but I can't prove that right now. I said, but then they said to me, well, what did you make of all of the internet searches by Ellen looking for ways to take her own life?
That's something else. And
I said, wait a second. What did I didn't make anything of it because that's not in my file. And they said, yes, it is. I said, I will tell you right now, hand on Bible, gun to head, that was not in the file. So I asked simply, where did it come from? I've been asking that for a very long time. And I don't know. I don't know if there's an answer, but no one has answered that question for me.
All right. The way I understand it, there were allegedly two searches by the FBI. The first one that the officials claim showed no evidence of suicide searches. Then, miraculously, there was word that another one had been performed, a re-review of the electronic devices by the FBI, and that did show evidence of searches involving suicide. And yet, according to investigator Tom Brennan and others, there is no record that the FBI did a second search. Is that correct?
Well, I didn't have a record that they did the first search. But what I also said to them is like, let me understand something. I have 20, like I said, on any given day, 20 plus homicides on my desk. I have people out there shooting every single day, taking the lives of innocent individuals. And it is a tall order at times. And when the FBI gets involved, it's awesome because they do a wonderful job, a masterful job. But I said, there's active homicides that I know are homicides, right? Guy got shot 22 times, 30 times, right? Homicide that we can't get at times FBI involvement. You're telling me that a case that's ruled a suicide, meaning case closed, that we're spending the money, not that it should be about money, right? But it's government, right? We're spending the money and resources and time to dump a computer of a woman who you all believe took her own life. To what end and what purpose? Why would we do that? It makes no sense. If this is like if you walk into a house and it's like someone had slit their wrist and there's a suicide note, it's like there's no question this is a suicide. Don't take the electronic devices, send them to the FBI laboratory and have them do a dump. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. So I said, well, wait a second. If there was an FBI dump of this computer, I had the police report? The police file. Why wasn't it in the file? Why wasn't it in my file? Why wasn't there what's called a property receipt or an indication that this was done? And I had the entirety of it. So you're telling me post fact that now there's FBI searches being done of a computer that was not in the original file? Like I had a hard time with that. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I just had a lot of questions again about how did this come to be, and why was this done if this was a suicide?
And you questioned Shapiro's office about that.
I did.
And what was her response?
I can't tell you that because that guy, we're in the middle of an investigation, which is not untrue, right? I mean, like if they were actually investigating this, they can't share information with a civilian. I get that. I mean, that would be unethical for them to do that. But
they can't confirm whether or not there were 2 FBI searches made.
Well, my questions were a little bit more colorful, but I mean, yeah, I mean, I wanted to know where these came from, where they got this. So I was asking about the process, right? They can't share that with the civilian.
Well, Guy, are we to conclude, and I know you don't want to commit yourself to this, but what everybody listening is, I'm going to ask what everybody's thinking. Are we to conclude that Shapiro's office simply made up a story that there were 2 FBI searches?
No, I'm not concluding that. I am not. You're never going to get me to say that. But what I will say is the question I have is, and just, I mean, there is reports now, right? There is a generation of material that says she searched these things. My question is simply, where did this actually come from? Who ordered it? Because it wasn't, I didn't see it from the DA's office ordering it. I didn't see it from the police department would have no reason to order it because they ruled it a suicide. So just like, where did this come from? Like, I'm not saying they fabricated it. I'm just saying, tell me where it came from.
All right. Bringing the viewers up to date who may not know some of this. A lot of them already know this, have been following this assiduously. But anyway, the way this thing is now, because Greenberg's team, the lawyers and others, presented allegations that there was a conflict of interest on Shapiro's part. Shapiro finally recused himself, if that's the right term, and kicked it over to the Chester County DA's office. Actually, it was referred back to the Philadelphia DA's office, and then the DA's office sent it to Chester County, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so now, in doing so, Shapiro's office said, well, although they've alleged a conflict, and there is no such conflict that exists, but, I'm being a nice guy and kicking it out anyway. But at the same time, he's accusing Attorney Pedraza and Tom Brennan generally, and the Greenberg's side of withholding evidence, such as the finding by the neuropathologist that it was inflicted post-mortem, this and that. He's saying, he never saw this evidence before it was being withheld from him. Now, that clearly is not true, correct?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Pedraza and Tom Brennan, if we're called to I look, I can never say 100%, right, in terms of what a person will do. I would be shocked if someone from the AG's office called them and said, come up to us and give a presentation with your evidence as to why you believe this should be either determined to be undetermined or potentially changed to a homicide. Joe and Tom would have been in the car 5 minutes later. I mean, that's a little tongue in cheek, but they would have been in the car and they would have presented that evidence. So I don't believe they want the right thing done, Tom and Mr. Pedraza.
Well, guys, the way I understand it, they did inform Shapiro's office about this evidence.
Oh, they've been singing to the rooftops. Here's the evidence. Someone please come and review it.
There's no way that Shapiro doesn't know they were bringing this evidence to him for examination, correct?
I can't believe that. I mean, Joe and Tom have been wanting everyone to review this. They want justice. Whatever that may lead to, they just want justice.
There's something else of a speculative nature. I know you can't address it directly, but it's out there now. People are thinking this, that is Shapiro already setting the groundwork to cover his rear end in case the Chester County DA, who's supposedly reopening the case, does turn around the finding and says it was a homicide. Then Shapiro could say, well, it's not my fault. They never presented this evidence before. How would I have known? Is this a cover your rear end move?
I will say this. I'm happy that Shapiro honored the alleged or perceived, I shouldn't say alleged, perceived conflict, which is what we want all of our elected prosecutors, whether it's state or local. If there's a conflict, you should recuse yourself, and not just yourself, your office.
But it'd be a way for him to distance himself, that, he had nothing to do with not examining this evidence properly because it was never presented to him.
He could say that. I mean, politicians say a lot of things,
I know I'm putting you on this.
Yeah.
Thanks for bearing with me through this. But anyway, now the next question is, will there be an objective, thorough, nonpartisan examination by the Chester County DA, who is also a Democrat, as Shapiro is? And, since Shapiro is the Attorney General of the entire state, and since he may soon be governor at the top of the heap, would there be any pressure on her to conform with Shapiro's findings that it was a suicide, or will she investigate this properly and objectively for the first time?
I hope so. I will tell you this. I have a tremendous amount of affinity for the Chester County District Attorney's Office. That was where I did my 2 years in law school as a certified legal clerk, where I actually put cases on in Coatesville, and then elected DA Joe Carroll. Just a wonderful man. The entire office, I have just wonderful things to say about the integrity of that office and the individuals who work there. And so I have all the confidence in the world, and I hope I'm not mistaken when I say that they will do a proper investigation. But it's been many, many, many years since I've been in that office, but I believe in the integrity of that office.
This, assuming that it will be a thorough and competent, objective investigation, this could be slow walked for years, can it not?
It could take it's going to take time, right? And then, I don't know that the outcome potentially is ever going to be what anybody wants, right? I mean, I've always said this, that the sad thing, well, there's many sad, and sad is not even the right word, but let's say they ruled a homicide, right? I know that would probably have some solace to the family, or maybe even undetermined, but what's the next step, right? I mean, how could you prosecute someone at this point without a confession or some eyewitness to the homicide, if that's what it was ever ruled? What evidence? I mean, it would be very challenging. And that's because things, and I agree with you, what earlier you said, I mean, things were missed and mistakes were made. And I get that it happens, but when it happens repeatedly in a particular case, especially of this nature, it's just not right.
And let's make it clear at this point, if we haven't already, that Sam Goldberg, the fiance, has never been named as a suspect or even a person of interest.
That's correct. I mean, my review of the file initially is that he was a witness, and that's what he was interviewed as.
All right, Guy DeAndrea, thanks for staying with us through this now. So wrapping it up now, we both agree that at the very least, this finally deserves a thorough investigation, proper investigation, which to this point has not been done, correct?
I agree with that.
Okay, and if it's not overturned, the medical examiner's report isn't overturned from suicide to homicide, you think at the very least it should be declared undetermined?
I've been saying that from my initial review of this file. At a minimum, that should be what it is. That's what the evidence shows. There's just the evidence we do have and the questions that it presents. I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. I mean this. I mean, it at a minimum, it should be undetermined. It's obscene if that doesn't happen.
Guy DeAndrea, thanks very much for being with us, and we'll be talking again as this investigation hopefully proceeds. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you.